Hey everybody, welcome to Crazy Tech Lab, and it is one of the biggest hardware launches of the year today. We are finally allowed to reveal the performance numbers of Intel's Arrow Lake desktop processors. So we have the Core Ultra 9285K, which is basically the equivalent of the old 14900K, and also the Core Ultra 5245K, which is basically the equivalent of the old Core i5 14600K. And exactly the same core counts, but Intel has removed hyperthreading. We've got a new architecture, all that kind of stuff. The E-cores have been boosted as well with more cache. So there's a lot of things that are changing this time around. We also have slightly lower frequencies. So how is that going to impact things? And plus that there are fewer threads due to the removal of hyperthreading, how is that going to affect performance? So some very, very interesting questions to answer today in the benchmarks. Now, I will say from the outset that this has not been a straightforward launch. There were all sorts of issues. To start with, I couldn't even get the motherboard that I used to actually boot. It needed to be flashed with a USB stick before it would even boot with one of these CPUs in. There were issues with the graphics cards and drivers. For some reason, if you installed Windows with your display connected to the VGA card or your graphics card, that would basically mess things up. So you had to reinstall Windows, and then you had to remove the DisplayPort cable or HDMI cable and plug it into your motherboard instead, install the integrated graphics drivers and everything else, and then switch the cable back after you've installed your discrete GPU driver and plug it into your graphics card, and then things would work. Kind of weird. There's been a bit of issues with the performance data as well. So especially with games, there seem to be some results that were very, very slow, very inconsistent results overall, I think. And that seems to be mirrored with a lot of other people out there as well. So I know there's a lot of people that gained quite a few grey hairs with this launch and didn't get a lot of sleep because things just weren't making sense. Overall, though, I think we can come to a conclusion today, and obviously we've got the power consumption and thermals to talk about as well, which are obviously other things that Intel has been bragging about. So that's basically the plan for today, is to run through the usual set of benchmarks, both in content creation and also in gaming, look at the power, thermals, and come to some conclusions at the end. I'd like to thank MSI for sending over the fabulous MEG Z890 Ace, a really, really nice motherboard there, and we're going to be taking a look at that on the channel very, very soon. So that was my test motherboard here today. And also to Intel for sending over the two processors that we've got so far, the Ultra 9285K and the Ultra 5245K. Now, we've already gone over the specifications and the pricing, but what I'll do now is just put that up, or that big table up on the screen, so those of you that haven't seen that yet can take a look at things. And obviously the pricing, reasonably aggressive, I think, compared to what's out there at the moment. And obviously, if you look at the core and thread counts, they are the same because Intel has removed hyperthreading. So we have exactly the same core counts as the previous generation, so no core count increases this time, and the same number of threads. So obviously interesting to see how that's going to impact the multi-threaded scores especially. Now, the big thing we need to talk about is that AMD had just released, when I actually did this video, or just announced rather, that they are going to be releasing a 3D V-Cache Ryzen 9000 Zen 5 model within the next week or so. So on November the 7th, that will be available, and obviously you will want to check out the performance of that before you're considering investing in one of these. So definitely want to check that out as well. We'll be looking at that here on the channel. And down below you can see a whole bunch of links to my Amazon shop where you can pick all the best hardware that I've tried and tested here on the channel. I get a small cutback from those sales and it just helps keep me running the channel. And don't forget to like and comment on this video as well, just helps punch me through the algorithm and gets me noticed. And finally, it means a lot to have your support if you could subscribe to my channel and turn on those notifications as well. Lots of interesting links in the description down below, and you can even buy me a coffee as well using one of those links down there if you found this video today informative. So that's it from me. Let's crack on with the testing and the benchmarks. First up, we should talk about my test system, and this included, as I mentioned earlier, an MSI MEG Z890 Ace motherboard, along with 48 gigabytes of 8200 MHz Kingston DDR5 QDIMM memory. So QDIMM is basically where you have the clock driver on board the memory, and it allows for much higher performance, much higher frequencies on that memory. So that's probably going to be a feature of Arrow Lake, as will overclocking be. You'll probably see lots of words about memory performance and overclocking and all that kind of stuff, but that's the reason why I decided to go for the higher speed memory here, because it's kind of what Intel recommends, and it does look like it's going to be the new standard, and we have some tests later to show the improvements of that. All of the testings here for the other AMD and Intel systems, we are using pretty much exactly the same stuff, except we have DDR5 6000 memory installed. As for drivers and software, we're using all the latest stuff from Nvidia and Microsoft as of October the 15th, and that includes Windows 11 24H2 with all the updates. First up, we have Cinebench, the R24 version, and the single core test here, and Intel does pretty well. The Core Ultra 9 285K coming out on top, and the Core Ultra 5 245K beating the Core i9 14900K in the single core test, and obviously offering a substantial lead over the Core i5 14600K as well, but doesn't quite manage to beat the two Ryzen 9 series CPUs that we have in the test though. Moving on to the multi-core test, and this is a benchmark that I've been wanting to run on these CPUs ever since I heard that they weren't going to have hyper-threading, but it does seem like Intel's claims that there will be a net benefit in multi-threaded performance were true. So the Core Ultra 9 285K obviously way out in front at the top and beating the Ryzen 9 9950X and the Core i9 14900K by a fairly wide margin, so it's good news there for Intel. The Core Ultra 5 245K, the cheaper model, not offering quite as much benefit over the other CPUs on test. The Core i5 14600K giving it a run for its money, but obviously the Core Ultra 5 245K is way out in front ahead of the Ryzen 5 9600X. Moving on to the Puget Systems test now then, and first up is Adobe Premiere Pro, and again we have a win for Intel, but obviously this is where things start to become less multi-threaded, relying on other things. So we've got the Core Ultra 9 285K sitting at the top of the graph, but really not offering that much more performance over the Ryzen 9 9950X or the Core i9 14900K. But the results are pretty squished here. The 14600K obviously being outdone by the Ultra 5 245K by a much wider margin. And the Ryzen 5 9600X, well, it's well down there at the bottom of the graph, so the Core Ultra 5 245K enjoys a pretty substantial lead over its Ryzen 9000 counterpart. Next up, we have the Puget Systems Davinci Resolve test, and here again, Intel performing pretty well. The Core Ultra 9 285K offering pretty much the same performance as the Core i9 14900K and Ryzen 9 9950X. Going further down the graph, we have the Core Ultra 5 245K outperforming the Ryzen 5 9600X, but here the Core i5 14600K does outstrip the Ultra 5 by 400 points or so. Next up is the Puget Systems Photoshop test, and this seems to be one of the tests, and there were a few of them this time round that just didn't seem to work that well with the Core Ultra 9 or the Ultra 5. So the Ultra 9 being outstripped even by the Ryzen 5 9600X, but that said, the Zen 5 architecture did seem to really enjoy this test, and it was the same with the other Ryzen 9000 series CPUs as well. And obviously, because they're pretty similar to the Ryzen 7000 series, the 7000 series also does very well here as well. So the only things that the Ultra 9 and Ultra 5 do beat though are the older 14th gen models. Moving on to the UL Procyon combined Photoshop and Lightroom test, so we've got a bit of Lightroom action going on in here as well. And the Core Ultra 9, again, sitting behind the Ryzen 9000 series models, even the Ryzen 5 9600X outstripping it. But again, it's a similar story. The 285K beats the 14900K, and the 245K beats the Core i5 14600K. So generation on generation, there's a small uplift in performance, but AMD wins out when it comes to the this specific benchmark. Moving on to HandBrake, where we're dealing with a 6GB H.265 4K encode, and we have the Core Ultra 9 285K really showing what it's capable of here. So 109 seconds compared to 123 seconds for the Core i9 14900K, and also beating the Ryzen 9 9950X. The Core Ultra 5 245K also outstripping the 14600K and the 9600K by significant margins. Moving on to our first game test then, Cyberpunk 2077, and this is where things started to get a little bit weird for the Core Ultra series, because given what we've seen elsewhere, you would expect, given the lightly threaded and the multi-threaded increases in performance, or at least matching the Core i9 14900K in most situations, if not beating it, you would expect it to perform similarly or better in games. That's not what I saw here. Now, I reinstalled Windows, tried different drivers, I even tried a different motherboard and different CPUs to the ones that I had. Nothing seemed to make a difference. So I literally swapped everything out, but I could not get these CPUs to run very well in Cyberpunk. So obviously everything else is pretty much where you expect it to be in games. The X3D chips at the top, Ryzen 9000 in second place, and the 14th gen models in third place, but the Core Ultra series just languishing down there with some pretty pitiful frame rates. Now moving on to Assassin's Creed, and we see a slightly better situation for Intel in this game, which is quite different to Cyberpunk in terms of the parts of the system that it taxes. And here we generally have the two CPUs performing pretty much as expected, which is either matching or bettering their predecessors, such as the 14900K and the 14600K. They also beat the Ryzen 9000 series non-X3D parts, but the Ryzen 7000 X3D parts offering significantly higher frame rates at 1080p. Moving up to 1440p, and it's a slightly different story with the Core Ultra 9 285K performing pretty well, offering a similar minimum 99 percentile to the Ryzen 7 7800 X3D, but the latter offering a higher average frame rate, while the Ultra 5 245K closely matching the 14900K and offering a decent uplift over the 14600K and Ryzen 5 9600X. So next up we have Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, and there's obviously a new version of this game coming out very, very soon. So this is probably going to be the last, if not penultimate, last time that I actually run this game, and it is a pain to run, to be honest, because you have to keep it up to date in order to run it. So if they release a new patch that affects performance, you are basically left with no option but to ditch your old results and have to retest everything on the new patch. So it's not an ideal game, so it's probably going to be one of the last times that I run this one. And it also seems to not be particularly favourable to the new Arrow Lake CPUs, which languished below the Core i9 14900K at 1080p, stepping up to 1440p, and again it's AMD that has the upper hand with the X3D models and the Ryzen 9 models. Moving on to our last game test now then, and Counter-Strike 2, again another situation which really doesn't favour the Core Ultra series of processors. So the Core Ultra 5 245K languishing at the bottom of the graph in both tests, significantly slower than the Ryzen 5 9600X and the Core i5 14600K, and it was the same situation at 1440p as well. The Core Ultra 9 285K does a little bit better, but still the Core i9 14900K and the X3D models offering significantly higher frame rates at both resolutions. Moving on to the power consumption now then, and Intel pretty much did exactly what it said in reducing power consumption. So anywhere where the CPUs are performing the same or better, you're basically getting a much more efficient processor. So for example, in under maximum processor load, so this was in Cinebench's multi-core test, the Core Ultra 5 245K seeing the system draw 241 watts from the raw compared to 323 for the Core i5 14600K, so a significant power saving there. And stepping up to the Core Ultra 9 285K, we actually have it level pegging with the Ryzen 9 9950X. So if you wanted any kind of evidence that these CPUs are pretty efficient, it's that result there. And obviously the Core Ultra 9 doing that with more cores as well, albeit they are some of them are efficient cores, they're not all performance cores as well. So, but just look at that 351 watt system power draw compared to 461 for the Core i9 14900K. Now we have a little bit of memory testing here because I wanted to just show the impact of the faster memory speed that I used in some of the benchmarks, and starting with Davinci Resolve, and we have the Core Ultra 5 245K running at both 6000, DDR5 6000 and DDR5 8200, and here in Davinci Resolve didn't really make that much of a difference. The next test is Photoshop, and here the score went up by about 200 points, but obviously that's not a huge amount in the overall scheme of things and probably doesn't warrant buying the faster memory speed. Cinebench was pretty much the same. We're seeing a very small uplift compared to the two memory frequencies, and absolutely not really worth the extra cash that you're going to be spending on getting that faster memory. Moving on to games, and we have a couple to look at, which are Assassin's Creed at 1440p, and here we can see a sizable uplift in performance going from DDR5 6000 to 8200, and the minimum 99 percentile gaining the most in percentage terms, rising from 120 to 127 frames per second. Our final test here then is Cyberpunk 2077, and moving from DDR5 6000 to 8200, we do see a sizable performance uplift, with the minimum 99 percentile increasing by 3 frames per second from 69 frames per second to 72, and a 4 frames per second uplift in the average frame rate. Now, the final graph we're going to look at is the core temperature, because Intel has claimed that the new processors will offer lower operating temperatures, and that certainly seems to be true pretty much whichever way you look at it. So the peak core temperature, which is something that I don't usually like to do because you often get one core that's kind of a bit skewed and always spikes a lot higher than some of the others. But here, I haven't really noticed it that much with these CPUs, to be honest. There are usually a few cores that match up with the peak core temperatures. So even so, we do have the Core Ultra processors running a lot cooler than their i9 and i5 counterparts, as you can see in the graph. The 4900K, for example, a peak temperature of 88 compared to just 80 for the Ultra 9 285K. Now, the average core temperature is basically the temperature taken across all of the cores, and unless Core Temp isn't reading these CPUs correctly at the moment, which might be true, the E-cores seem to be running a lot hotter on the newer CPUs, and that would kind of make sense, but they were some of the hottest running cores if they are at the bottom of the Core Temp readout. So I'm not sure whether it's Core Temp just doing something weird there. I didn't have any other ways of measuring the P-core temperatures for the review. Hopefully there'll be some software that will work eventually, but even Intel XTU, the latest version, was meant to be compatible with these CPUs, and it threw up an error message at the start saying it wasn't. So there might be some other data out there from other people, but even the average core temperature across all of the cores, even though those E-cores seem to be sitting at much higher temperatures, even the average core temperature was a lot lower. So overall, whether you're looking at the average core temperature or the peak core temperature, Core Ultra is definitely a lot cooler. So what do we make of the Intel Core Ultra series then? Well, overall, it's pretty much as expected. There are some more significant gains than I thought we were going to see in areas such as content creation. So HandBrake, for example, very good results. Very good results in Cinebench in both the single and multi-threaded tests there as well. But that does raise the question about issues such as the Cyberpunk results that I saw, that all the systems exactly the same, everything installed exactly as it should be. The CPUs perform fine in some areas and just seem to fall off a cliff in others. And that to me suggests some kind of software problem behind the performance deficits, particularly in games like Cyberpunk and to some extent Counter-Strike as well. So some really weird results that I know a lot of us have been grappling with, and just comparing results and that kind of stuff. Obviously, this is a brand new socket, it's a new launch, so there are always going to be teething troubles, but we have seen much smoother launches on new sockets in the past. The 12th gen, for example, was nowhere near as flaky as this one. So it's an interesting move from Intel. The lower power consumption and lower thermals are very welcome. So generally, you're not really seeing much less power draw from AMD in terms of performance equivalents here. Much more power frugal and also much cooler running as well, which might even benefit some kind of builds out there, such as small form factor systems. You might be able to drop in a flagship CPU without the worry of heat and thermals and all that kind of stuff. So in terms of content creation performance, overall, it's very good. Again, one or two areas where they were maybe slightly underperforming, but overall, it's very good, especially in areas such as HandBrake and certain photo editing applications. But again, it's just that gaming performance that seems to be relatively inconsistent. Now, I've only covered a few games here, but it feels like I've got a rough picture even just in the games that I've tested of what everybody else has been experiencing overall throughout testing a larger number of games. So other people out there might find that things are pretty much performing as they are, but certainly the people that I've spoken to have had a few inconsistent results and stability issues as well. So It seems like it's a bit of a work in progress. I wouldn't go as far as saying it was rushed, but it does seem like both AMD and Intel are kind of trying to get things out as quickly as possible and almost competing with each other for the worst possible processor launch in quite a long time at the moment. So for now, obviously, I wouldn't recommend buying these CPUs because we've got the AMD 3D V-Cache model coming out very, very soon. So it would be interesting to see if anybody's running some up-to-date benchmark numbers with newer drivers and what Intel has to say on actually fixing some of these issues. But for now, we definitely have some 3D V-Cache models coming out, and they are looking very, very promising, not just in gaming performance, but hopefully outside of gaming as well. So they could be some excellent all-rounders if you are doing a mixture of content creation and gaming at home. So overall today, it's pretty good. Lower thermals, lower power consumption, excellent multi-threaded performance, and performance outside of games. Performance in games, pretty much as we expected. There's not really any benefit over the 14900K and 14600K, which are the predecessors of the two CPUs that we looked at today. But some question marks remain over some very inconsistent and underperforming results in games. So that's it from me today. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks to MSI again for sending over the motherboard and dealing with today's video. And we'll be back very, very soon with a lot more stuff, including the AMD 3D V-Cache launch in early November. So don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll be back very, very soon.